mostly
They have a strategy to get it.
they have actually they have done a bunch of books on so they just did one on the about people getting all right that could very easily happen.
Yeah.
And like I have gone to things before and then there's also
Like scams.
are you into scams? Love doing them?
Love it. Love doing scams. What's your favorite type of scam? No.
I love the plastic pig.
Pig laundering. Actually, I wouldn't love the Chinese. It works much better in Chinese. It's laundering in Chinese. Keeping game. Chinese idiom is so much better than any other language. I did a screening for my team on the film No More Bets.
Oh yeah.
The Chinese 2023 blockbuster.
Yeah. Which I listened to a story about. Is it to do, yeah, with people being like abducted?
Yeah, human trafficking. Yeah.
This American Life podcast? No, it's not very This American Life.
Who did this? I also listened to a podcast. I can't remember who did it. Was it the miniseries in itself?
It wasn't Replyable.
London Review of Books?
It was a search engine.
Could have been a search engine. Yeah.
But it wasn't PJ Vogt who did it.
It's like featuring. Did he do it as
Slower than
No, you're right. It wasn't. I didn't think it was such a Oh yeah, no, it was. Who's behind all these scammy text messages people were getting? Number go up.
Wait, not yeah.
No.
There wasn't PJ Vogt who did the editing. Deceit, yeah, Deceit.
All right, welcome everyone tonight. It's a pleasure to see so many of you come tonight for this really exciting panel and important, as we think, about scamming. If you think we're gonna get tips for scamming, this is the wrong room. It's down the street, but I think we're gonna have an important and nice discussion nevertheless. If it's your first time at the Frontline Club, just a quick reminder that you can follow our newsletter, follow us on social media, or come to another event like this. And if it's not your first time and you like what you're seeing, maybe think about becoming a member. It really helps us supporting independent journalism. And without further ado, it's my honor to give over to Geoff White.
Yes, and welcome from me as well. Thanks for coming along on this lovely Monday evening to the hidden world of scamming. Although, thanks to the panelists that we've got with us today, the hidden world of scamming is getting slightly less hidden. I've cast a really, really wide beam on all of these issues. Some of you in the audience might have been affected directly yourselves by scams. You will almost certainly know somebody who has. I'm certain in the UK, fraud is, I think, the most common criminal offence, more common than any other criminal offence out there. I think the cost of the US economy was something like 15 billion from scams last year, as I remember in the latest report. So it is an absolutely massive issue. And what's fantastic about our panelists is they've shed light on the dynamics behind that. So yes, we're going to be looking at scamming, but we're also going to be widening this out to look at the kind of corruption and bribery that goes behind those kind of things and enables this sort of industry. So I'm going to start at your right-hand side, my left-hand side. You will have, I'm sure, have heard of, or maybe even hopefully heard, the Economist podcast Scam Inc. We are delighted to have the producer here, Sam Colbert, who's a senior podcast series producer at The Economist and worked with Su-Lin Wong, who presented that fantastic series. It's available now on all your favorite podcast platforms, wherever you get your podcasts. That's what they say, isn't it? Oh, just terrible American accent there. Which is equally embarrassing because we have two folks from North America with us here today. We've got Peter Klein in the middle, who has worked for NBC, CBS, NBC for 30 years on investigations, and most recently was working on the documentary called Bribe Inc., which I highly recommend, well worth tracking down, which looks at the issue of bribery and corruption that sits behind a lot of this stuff. And lastly, but by no means leastly, Kate Griffin, who's Director of Programs at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. We're going to be talking about systemic responses we can do to this kind of stuff. Before we get started, though, let's take a quick look, if we can. We're going to see a clip from Scam Inc., and we're also going to take a clip from Bribe Inc., so you know roughly what we're talking about.
Hi, I'm Su-Lin Wong. A couple of years ago, I made a podcast about China's leader, Xi Jinping, called The Prince. I've been reporting a news story over the past year. And though it started in Asia, it took me about as far away from my usual beat as I could imagine. Behind it is a dystopian criminal underworld of forced labour, corruption, and intrigue.
Three girls were there.
This is provided on a scale that had never been seen. It was epic. The figures were billions of dollars worth of contracts.
You know, was doing his business wherever there was that lucrative oil field.
Corruption hotspots.
Line of competition. Every other country in the world is doing it. We're not allowed to. So it puts us at a huge disadvantage.
It's doing extraordinary damage in huge swaths of the world.
There's a hard drive with all these secrets on it. There's thousands and thousands of emails with hard evidence of corruption.
Bringing kids home, being a corrupt businessman, keeping detailed records of the bribes you paid is an absolutely terrible idea.
There was a European arrest warrant issued by the British authorities, and they would be shredding files, burning laptops, shutting down the whole project operation.
The pressure was on.
How can this global group manage to spend one night in a lone jail cell? The FBI went behind the back of the UK authorities. Especially when you fight for rich and powerful, you're going to be looking over your shoulder the rest of your life.
Gosh, there we go. A couple of clips there from Scam Inc. the podcast and Bribe Inc. The documentary. And as you find out, not the only link, the ink between those two. Sam, let's start with you first of all. Scam Inc. Covers this very professionalized network scam industry, which people may have come across, sometimes called something like pig butchering. I hate that phrase, but it is the shorthand that people are using. What does that phrase mean, and how does that tie into what you're trying to cover in the podcast? How does this stuff work?
Yeah, the phrase is interesting. It's originally a Chinese phrase that was translated into English, but the metaphor is the scammer fattens up their target, the pig, before the slaughter, ultimately taking them for everything they have. But the scam functions like you might get a message on, it'll be a message on WhatsApp or a social media platform or a dating app, and someone will strike up a conversation, try to befriend you, build a relationship, sometimes over many days or many weeks before they happen to mention that they've made a lot of money in crypto investing, and would you like me to show you how it works? And people will invest in what turns out to be bogus platforms and chase good money after bad. They're then told to get their money out, they have to pay taxes or add a verification fee, and people in many cases will pour into it everything they have, and then through the encouragement of the scammer will borrow money from friends and relatives to try to get their principal back, and then are left destroyed in the end of it.
Very good, fine. World's shortest fire alarm. You have two tweets. So obviously, people probably be familiar with romance fraud, which has been around for a long time on dating apps. People get seduced by some, handsome or beautiful partner, and then gradually defrauded of money. What's interesting about this scam that you describe is it's got some of that, but it's also got sort of crypto investment type methodology to it as well. Is that part of what makes it effective? It combines those two things together.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what makes it so insidious. Is if it was just the romance piece, if it was just someone online trying to get you to send them money, it'd be more suspicious. Or if it was just the investment piece, if it was someone who came to you with some too good to be true investment opportunity, that wouldn't be so convincing. But the way it plays out is the person being scammed feels like they're in it with the person who's ultimately scamming them, because they think they've got this romantic relationship and we're in this thing together, and when it goes wrong, the person on the other end of the line can kind of step away from blame and say, oh, it's the site being strange. And there have been cases where, and I've spoken to people who are at the end of this thing, they've lost everything, but they still believe that that person who they were speaking to was in love with them, or they were in love with that person, had this relationship, and that this person is still their ticket somehow to recover everything they've lost. And you heard there about this bank CEO in Kansas who lost everything he had, and then everything the bank had. He sent $47 million of the bank's money and blew it on this scam. And still 6 months after the collapse of the bank, he believed apparently this woman he'd been speaking to online would make it all right. And he traveled from Kansas to Australia, where he thought she lived, to try to meet her. And she obviously never appeared, and he's gone to prison. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was an astonishing case. And as you say, the bank collapsed, and that person was still, even after it all, the message could just never get through that this was a scam.
Yeah.
Kate, I want to come to you on this. There's an interesting sort of psychology around this. I find it fascinating that victims of scams, it's incredibly difficult to get those folks to acknowledge that they have been victims of scam, even when you present them with all of the evidence. From your own experience of this, is there explanations behind that? What do you think is going on behind that?
Yeah, what we're talking about here is a crime that's fundamentally based on social engineering, right? Often you will find victims that have been approached by these criminals in times of distress in their lives, a period of loneliness, or even just being in a hurry that day, right? We've heard of there's a victim that we have been speaking with who, her husband had gotten a cancer diagnosis, and she was rushing him to the doctor, and she got a call, and it was an FBI agent telling her that her social security number had been compromised, and off she went and lost $500,000. And so because we are living so much of our lives online, right, your ability to target and find someone who may be experiencing those things is heightened, and there's an ability to prey on that knowledge about what's going on in your life, and be more successful because you can kind of reach somebody when their defenses are down.
By the way, we should sort of talk about what is the Aspen Institute and what does the Financial Security Program do before we go any further. We can address your interface with
Happy to do that. So the Aspen Institute is a US-based nonprofit organization. We focus on values-based leadership, working with leaders in government, in the private sector, to solve some of the biggest social challenges of our time. The work I do is focused on household financial challenges. So we came to this because there are enormous household financial consequences happening. You talked about the $15 billion, and I always have to correct people because that's what's reported.
yes,
right?
yes.
Because so this happens to someone, and it's also something where people feel an immense amount of shame. And that's fair. We don't do a good job of telling people that you were the victim of transnational organized crime rings. No, we say you were stupid. right? And that's a terrible thing that we're doing. And then people don't tell law enforcement. They don't report what has happened.
Sometimes don't tell their own families. When
Don't
it's done up.
sometimes don't tell
Yeah,
their
yeah,
own families.
It happened to my mom, and I didn't find out
Oh my
till
goodness.
10 years after she died.
Oh
But it
my
happened to her.
goodness.
Yeah.
So you see, so we think, just to astonish folks, the one of the groups in the United States that tracks the data, the Federal Trade Commission, has put a fudge factor on their numbers. So their latest numbers were 12 billion for last year. They think, given what they believe the underreporting amount is, that it was $158 billion to the U.S. economy last year.
158 billion.
Yes, 1 in 6 Americans.
So that's so reported figure might be something like 12 to 15 billion, but the actual figure, given the underreporting, would be something like 10 times higher.
Yeah.
Astonishing.
Astonishing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so what we're doing is that, did you want me to say that too?
Yeah, go on to that. No, yes.
When we talk about solving big social challenges, what we've done is to pull together, and really we were approached by a number of the largest companies involved in this, to say, here in the United States, we are siloed in our ability to fight scams. So we all have our own regulatory systems. We have our own rules and procedures, and what the criminals exploit is the things in between. So we trust Aspen to bring us together, because we're not going to agree always on what the solution is, to find what is the ecosystem approach. How do we bring together an ecosystem of defenses to prevent criminals from entering into our systems, from being able to spoof an FBI phone number, create a fake investment website, operate on Match.com, whatever you have, all the way through to convincing somebody to move their money. And so we have kind of all of those elements of those companies at the table coming together to talk about what are the sort of partnerships they can create to build those defenses and prevent scams from happening.
Good stuff. Thanks for that. One of the things I find interesting about the scam stuff that you've identified in the podcast is the sort of systematized, very business-like focus of it. You know, there'll be a business unit that deals with this, a business unit that deals with that. That, you know, scamming is a very diversified, very networked business that goes on sort of internationally. You need multiple parties in multiple countries all sort of working together. And that's why, Peter, I wanted to bring in your work now, particularly with Bribe Inc. and the other work that you've done around sort of corruption and bribery and so on. First of all, Bribe Inc. focuses on this company called Unit Oil, largely.
Yep.
What was this company? What did they do? What did you uncover about them in Bribe Inc.?
Sure. So the bribing story is a little oblique to the scams, but as I think we'll realize, there's a lot of overlap. It was a company out of Monaco, run by British citizens, that had essentially their business model. This is simplifying a little bit, but their business model was they were a engineering consulting firm, but their business model really was essentially helping major multinational corporations, Rolls-Royce, Halliburton, Samsung, Honeywell, you name it, get deals in Iraq and Libya and Algeria and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, or rich countries where there is a breakdown of the rule of law, and that's where we're getting some overlaps here with KK Park, and they were like, look, we'll help you figure this out. We'll get you the deal. Give us a little extra money. We'll consult for you. And everyone knew what was happening. They were essentially the bag man doing these bribes for years and years and years and years. And they would probably still be doing it if it hadn't been for an employee there who blew the whistle and reached out to a journalist, my partner in Australia, Nick McKenzie, an amazing journalist, and said, listen, I have all the goods, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that lays out the scope of probably the biggest bribery scandal in modern history, and put an ad in Le Figaro newspaper, advertising with this code word for a villa in Sydney Harbor. And he was like, all right, 20 euros, whatever. It's probably some scam, probably some, or maybe one of my colleagues.
It's an insane start to the story, that. As the journalist, you get asked, if you want the story, put an advert in this newspaper. I love the fact that Nick went for it.
He went for it. He was
why
like,
not?
why not? And he did it, and he flew all the way to France, and he met him, and it was all real, and blew open this case. And the interest, I mean, that's an interesting part of the story, but the other interesting part of the story is how the entire global law enforcement infrastructure blew this case. They were handed 320,000 pages of internal emails that detailed financial records, everything. As the British prosecutor this said, like, kids at home, if you want to do scams, don't write everything down. They wrote everything down. There was just like, it was so easy. It was an open and shut case. And the Brits, the Serious Fraud Office was developing this case, and the Americans basically stole the case from them. They got that guy fired under false pretenses, and the Brits were going after them, trying to put people in jail, and the Americans stole the case so that they could get fines from the companies, and the bad guys walked.
And the three people at the heart of Unit Oil, you were saying, are actually living right now in London.
In London, it's between London and Monaco. So I don't know. There's a death threat in the film, so hopefully.
It might be in the audience. So what's interesting is, I mean, this company on the outs, internally, what they did was effectively they worked out who in places like Iraq you needed to pay off to get the oil deal. Basically, said, look, you give us the money, we'll funnel it to them. But they can't have had that on their website. How did they sort of outwardly describe themselves, Unit Oil? What was their sort of public face of what they?
Yeah, no, their public face, and the person who started it, Atta Sani, was a respected petrochemical engineer, and I think from everything I could tell, he knew what he was doing, and he had people around him. Basil Al-Jarrah, a number of people who were really, really like respected, and innovative. So, it's a shame because what they were trying to do good work, and then they realized that we could make a lot more money if we take some shortcuts. And no one's who's gonna. I mean, if I'm bribing you, there's two people involved: me, the briber, and you, the bribe taker. Neither of us have any incentive on narking on the other one. So it's easy for these crimes to continue in the shadows. And so they started cutting corners and cutting corners and cutting corners, and realized along the way that if we pay someone off to find out what the competitive bid is, we'll be able to win this bid. I mean, they were doing all sorts of things like that. I think to this day, a little bit like the scam victims who can't seem to get out of their heads, like, but they really love me. Like, to this day, a lot of the people involved in these were like, look, we didn't really, it's a victimless crime. Everyone's doing it. What's the big deal? I can't believe, they don't film about this, and prosecutors are making a big deal out of this. But, as we tried to show in the film, like, bribery, corruption matters. The cyber criminals, we haven't gotten into this, but like the people on that other side of the phone, as the podcast does a brilliant job explaining, are themselves victims. They can't get trafficked without bribery. Human trafficking, gun running, bioweapons. I've done plenty of work on bioweapons and chemical weapons. All of that involved bribery. Like, any kind of illicit activity has bribery as a central part of it. And so it is not a victimless crime. That's kind of what I've learned.
Yeah. Well, it's a good time to bring Sam back in then, because one of the links I wanted to make was that you talked about the scams, the way the scams operate on the victim side. And as Peter's thrown ahead to, there's somebody on the phone or on the apps, on the dating apps, making contact with the victim. Tell us a bit about where that's coming from, who's doing that, and how they end up in that situation.
Yeah.
Because scammers on the scammer side.
Yeah, we spoke to several people who themselves had been the scammers on the other side, and they had remarkably similar stories where they were from various parts of the world and they got a job offer. In the case of our podcast in Thailand, and it was something maybe they saw online, or in one case, one guy's friend told them about the job, and they got on the phone with the recruiter, and the recruiter bought them a plane ticket and flew them to Thailand, got them this visa, and they were picked up by a driver at the airport and then driven 8 hours to, they didn't know it, but to Myanmar. They were taken across a river at gunpoint and made to go into a big office block, essentially, walled off compound. And then under the threat of torture and death even, they were made to sit there 7 days a week, 12, 16 hours a day, and chat to people online and scam people online. That's not everybody. There are people who, if you're in Myanmar looking for work, this can be a lucrative job for people, but a lot of people are trafficked into it. And so that's, could very well be the person you're speaking to on the other end of the line. Yeah.
That's interesting. What I found fascinating about Jalil Miyeki, you interview in the podcast, this chap was from Uganda originally, and was trafficked he's tricked into thinking he's going to get a job in Bangkok. When he arrives at Bangkok, as you say, he's driven to Myanmar. What I found interesting was what these scam gangs face is what a lot of crime organizations face, is they've got a funnel. They've got to get victims in at the top and funnel them down to the, because of the 1,000 people you contact, let's say one will fall for the scam. So you've got to make 1,000. So you need someone to do that kind of grunt work. So they traffic these people in. People actually were just trafficked in to sort of just hammer the phones almost, or some cold calling people. I was thinking about artificial intelligence from that perspective. Do you think in the future AI will be used to do some of that sort of grunt work, cold calling stuff that they're trafficking people into at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And we heard from people who had done this work, forcibly done this work, who talked about how AI was already in use in certain ways. There was one woman who had been trafficked from South Africa, who she had male colleagues who were pretending to be women online and chatting with guys, and they would then want a phone call, and so she would go on the phone for them and do an accent, a fake accent, and then they'd want a video call. And so she would do it, and she would use an AI filter to change her appearance so she looked like the woman in the photos that the guys were sending to their victims. I mean, it's crazy. And they're using translation software, and yeah, and I think probably, to your point, Geoff, it will become more and more that way, because it's trafficking people into these compounds turns out to be a lot of trouble for the people who run these businesses. So I think probably as much as they can do that with AI, definitely they will, and they are. Yeah.
I want to say one thing about this that I found really interesting. I'm in town, as Kate is, for this scams conference, and I'm particularly interested in the AI part of this. And I was talking to someone about Denmark, how Denmark has been largely immune from these scams because, how many Danish-speaking, they're going to get English speakers, French speakers, German speakers, but there's not that many Danish speakers in India or Uganda that they're going to recruit into these things. So they've been immune from it, but now it's starting to ramp up because they're using AI, because it's gotten so sophisticated that they can do these automatic translation voices and mimic a Danish speaker calling from the federal police or the bank or whatever, or romance or whatever it might be. So in the role of AI, I think we're just at the infancy of seeing how this is going to transform this world.
Kate, Sam's mentioned Myanmar there, which has turned into one of these parts of Myanmar have turned into centres for these kind of operations. Where else in the world are we looking at this happening? And have we got an idea of how many people are involved in this kind of stuff?
Oh, more than we can imagine, I'm sure. So certainly there's a hotbed in Myanmar and Southeast Asia generally. As Sam reported, there were scam centers in the Philippines and elsewhere. It is a crime that is, I don't want to call it a franchise model, but replicable, right? And so you're seeing kind of similar things pop up now in parts of Africa and in parts of Latin America. Some other reporting showed in Georgia and Israel. So it's moving to a lot of places. And you're finding now also, while some of these are very sophisticated operations like KK Park in Myanmar, you could go online today and do a Google search for scam scripts. There are young men in developing countries finding scam scripts online and going off and doing this as individual actors, right? To say, here's what you do to do the outreach, here's what you do to string someone along. And so, it's becoming a replicable crime.
I don't know, there was, I think, a UN report that talked about something like 100,000 people in the situation that this Ugandan guy was in doing this. So you're talking about people in the hundreds of thousands of people working in these scam compounds.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just recently, so there was some reporting that had been done. One of the people that had been trafficked into one of the scam compounds in Myanmar was a sort of B-list actor in China. Sometimes these folks are able to keep their phones. He was able to get word out. His girlfriend raised the alarm. There became a social media outcry to free this young man. And China went in and actually, I think they alone freed something like 7,000 people. There were how many people released in the last week? Like 20,000 people. But by all accounts, there are still cranes building more dormitories. So while that was sort of a moment in which thankfully some victims were freed, it's not actually stemming the tide.
So we talked about, so I want to go back to you, Sam, on this. We talked about these sort of scam compounds. We talked about KK Park, which is a notorious example of this. What do these things look like when you go there? What do you see? How's it set up? How's it constituted?
Yeah, it's like a company town. Like you walk in and there are office buildings, there are dormitories, there are grocery stores, there's entertainment facilities. So if as I say, there's torture involved, there's also incentives involved, and so
there's actually a torture room in one of these places.
There's a torture room, yeah. You can go from the torture room over to the karaoke room, where there are drinks and drugs and sex workers, and these are both for the guests of the bosses who invite people in to these places, but also for the workers. They say, hey, if you do really well, you can come hang out with us at the karaoke bar. So yeah,
that ties into that thing of there's this sliding scale between people who are trafficked and imprisoned at one end. At the other end, there are people for whom this is just a job that they do and they earn money at it. But in the middle, there's this sort of grey area of, well, I'm here now, I didn't really expect to be doing this, but I'll earn some money at it. And actually, I'm quite good at this. And now the boss is like me. There's this, inevitably, a lot of these people are, trafficked people in bad circumstances. But there's this really interesting kind of grey area around. I found that quite interesting in the podcast.
Yeah, and we heard about people who were trafficked, escaped, got home, and because of the trauma they'd endured, had trouble adjusting to their old life, and so they went back. They went back and they said, well, at least there I can make some money and I have a job, and I don't have to kind of explain myself to my family. A lot of the people we spoke to who were in this situation, some of them never told anybody back home. They feel the same kind of shame that we found scam victims feel for their part in this industry. So there are people who told us their stories that didn't tell their families their stories. So it can be easier just to participate. Yeah.
Peter, this is going on in place. I mean, think of the countries that are prevalent for this: Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Philippines, I think, I'm right in saying. These are countries where, government struggles to reach, to have authority reach into these areas. And that ties into the sort of stuff you do in terms of, at the heart of this, there will be some bribery, there will be corruption. I mean, places in Myanmar, it's a sort of fiefdom, effectively, for sort of local warlords.
Yeah, and it's an organized business, run like a business, with bribery as part of it, torture as part of it, incentives, all of those things, trafficking. But for me, one of the transformative experiences of your podcast and some other things that I've read recently is really appreciating how vast and organized all of it is. That it's not, that person 15 years ago, the Nigerian scam, I mean, even that was somewhat organized probably in some cases, but it was also sort of one-off, the Nigerian prince, give me some money and I got to release the money. This is so organized with organized crime involved. And I mean, it's a double-edged sword from the Chinese standpoint, because Chinese tribes are involved, but unfortunately, like some of these guys, if they're the number of Chinese folks who have been trafficked, they go back to China, they're criminals, particularly the men. China doesn't recognize men being trafficked. So women can be trafficked, but men can't be trafficked according to Chinese law. So the men come back after having been these criminals, and then they end up are open to prosecution. So the whole system is screwed up.
One of the things we talk about in the work that we're doing is how do you disrupt the economics of this business model, right? So from soup to nuts. So from the beginning, it's incredibly easy to set up fake accounts online. We don't have quality identity authentication or proofing. It's easy to set up fake investment websites. It's sort of at every step, it's actually quite cheap. And particularly with AI and marketing tools being what they are, it's quite cheap to do that. And from a law enforcement perspective, it's hard to get caught, and the penalties are not very high. We don't treat this as the same severity of a level of crime of drugs or other things. And so from all accounts, like, we need to just level up our game in terms of making it more expensive to do this kind of crime.
This is what I found interesting about it. again, one of the interesting things in the podcast is this idea that, we think of organised crime as being the sort of mafia model where you have, the godfather at the top and then the lieutenants and all that sort of pyramid type structure. What's described in the podcast and what you guys witness is it's and this applies to Uniroyal as well. It's hard to work out who's actually in charge of any of that. It's networks of people working together in quite an organic, fluid, flat pyramid way. I presume that makes it harder to tackle as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, right. And you'll have a piece of it, like we were talking about the AI piece. I think a lot about the affiliate marketing that's done. So some of this is not necessarily a one-to-one outreach, but is like, I'm going to put up 40 different ads on Facebook Marketplace and see what bites I get, right? So is it a crime to be the company that creates the ad? I don't know, but that is a company's job, right? And so breaking it down into those component parts, some of which are in fact not criminal, to be a part of helps make it harder to disrupt.
That's true, yes. I can imagine somebody could get a job writing copy for a website that turns out to be one of these scam websites.
Right.
I'm just a copywriter. I just wrote a copy.
Right.
That's not technically a crime, is it?
Right.
Yeah. We're going to come on to questions in a sec, so I hope you've been storing your questions up. Before we do that, I just want to talk sort of journalistically about the process of how this is made. Peter, I want to come to you first. You've obviously got this leak of documents, which is great, but turning that into a televisual feast, it's not easy. How did you go about at the heart of it is this cache of documents, this company in Monaco. How do you then turn that into 90-minute document?
94 minutes. Yeah, I mean, the cache of documents, it was sort of manna from heaven because it was, most of it was very dry, very complicated business financial documents, but then they made it colorful. Thank you, storytelling guys. They used code words for the bad guys. So, and for the people that they were bribing, etc. They tried to obfuscate it a little bit with colorful code words. So, one person was lighthouse, because one person was doctor because he reminded them of someone on a soap opera who was a doctor. One person was Ivan because he really liked Russian sex workers. Like they came up with the Italian oil company was Spaghetti House. So they came up with these clever words. They didn't use the word bribe. The entire cache of documents is no reference to bribe. It was holiday. The doctor needs a 4-day holiday to make this happen. We should take him on a holiday. 4-day holiday is $1 million. So
4-day holiday would be $4 million.
So we had to break that code, and Nick did some great work kind of figuring out how to break that code and what all these code words meant. But then, as you say, it's just a lot of, I know many of you here are journalists, so, showing a document, showing a tear in a newspaper, or showing a graphic it's effective, certainly in a short form. But if you're trying to make a film, it can be a little bit difficult. So what we did is we set up a sort of a war room on these 3 glass boards with the key documents and the key, people, their headshots, etc. And we used a conversation in that war room throughout the film, kind of kept coming back with our 2 main characters, trying to understand how this all works. So it's really it's taken from, it's a common technique. I'm looking at Nick Gratz here, filmmaker. He probably uses this too. When you're making a crime drama or something, where you see this all the time, where the cops are like, "Well, let's review once again how this crime was done," and it's an explication for the audience, right? It's obviously they're actors; they don't need to review it. They're reviewing it for your benefit to sort of remind you, like, so this was the bad guy, and this was. But wait a minute, why did he do? Oh, this is why he did it. So we did that, sort of like, let's walk you through this as simply as possible in this room with all the documents. And then we made the documents come to life a little bit with some animation, but it wasn't all animated.
Again, journalistically, I want to stay with that.
But it was much harder for you.
300,000 emails, and I really sympathise with your reporter, Nick, trying to read through and trying to sort of string them all together. Just stitching back together an email reel when it's in the leak form like that is technically quite difficult. But I wonder, presumably in the future do you think there's going to be technology that make that easier? Can you actually get something to synthesize? Because what you really want to find is the juicy conversation, but it's buried somewhere in that 300,000.
We did do that, and we have a program. It was early AI actually trying to analyze it, looking for common terms and basically using different algorithms to kind of process all of that. Because it's a lot of content, and so that first pass was really valuable. And then the other thing that was really valuable was the leaker. So this guy who Nick codenamed Figaro because of the subterfuge of putting an ad in the paper and everything. So Figaro worked with Nick and worked with me as well to help us understand what this means. I would send him documents, and I would say, what's going on here? Is this? And sometimes I'd send him something, and he'd be like, "That's not nefarious, Peter. That's whatever." Because I don't work in
They genuinely went to a
international.
spaghetti house.
Yeah. But other times he would be like, "No, this is really, you don't appreciate how important this document is," and he'd kind of explain it all and help us with the codes and help us with the context, and so having him was invaluable. And he not only worked with us, he also worked with law enforcement. He worked with the FBI, and he worked with the Australian Federal Police, the FBI, and the Serious Fraud Office in the UK.
Because Sam, I want to come on to you because you've got, on the one hand, you don't have to try and turn this into TV. On the other hand, you've got a longer runtime to fill with a podcast series.
Yeah.
And also you and Sulin Wong are geographically separate. You're also dealing in territories like Myanmar, which are quite difficult to access. What were the sort of key challenges you came up against? How did you get over those?
Yeah, we talked a lot about where we should go in the podcast, and Myanmar was kind of the obvious place in that most of the coverage you'll see about these scam centers focus on Myanmar, and it's kind of obvious why they are allowed to flourish in a place like that. They're sort of lawless, and as you say, there's these fiefdoms. But where the podcast goes is actually the Philippines, which was partly practical because it's much easier to report there. It's a relatively free and democratic place. But in some ways, it's actually a more interesting case study in that it is free and democratic, and yet you go to a town and you see, behind the town hall, which we relate in the podcast, is this massive new complex in an otherwise kind of small, depressed town. And you ask people on the street and they say, "Oh, I don't know, I think it's a shopping center." And it turns out it's a big scam compound that's been allowed to operate right in this town through bribery and corruption. So that was one way we came at that particular reporting challenge of where do you go? And then the time zones, I was based in London, Sulin was based in Singapore, and we got to travel around a bit together, but just a lot of, I think Sulin worked very long days into the night talking to me in my morning in London. That's how we got around it, so.
It's true, yes, you need to stay on the phone.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
We've got a microphone around, so wait for the microphone to get to you because we're filming this, folks. We've got a question at the back, blue jumper, and then we'll come here and I'll try and get up.
Just quickly, you talk about governments having a hard time cracking down on it and fiefdoms, but to what extent are actually governments just complicit? And I mean, it's hard to believe that in Thailand there's not a lot of government complicity at the highest of levels. I'd be curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of temptation from people we spoke to try to trace it right back to the top somewhere, and it's difficult because, as you say, in the same way that, as you say, Geoff, in the same way that the corporate side of it is networked, the same is true on the government side, where it's not necessarily right to the top. It's corrupt officials here and there, and we in particular encountered a lot of people who wanted to tie it all back to China and the Chinese Communist Party. There's this theory we encountered floating around that, because these are Chinese origin criminal groups operating in the region, people would say, well, nothing happens in China or around China without the say-so of the Chinese Communist Party, and what do they care if some Westerners lose some money? And I think it's just too simple an explanation. It's again, more pervasive than that and less organized than that, and that in a way makes it more difficult to do anything about. I can't speak too much about specific country to country, but yeah, that's what we found.
I mean, oftentimes the complicity is not necessarily at the national level. Even in China, I mean, it's very localized, the corruption in China, right? So oftentimes the corruption is on that local level. I'm sure in Kicking Park, Myanmar, there's plenty of knowledge and complicity on certain levels. So that, certainly that's what I found in my reporting on corruption, that a lot of it is localized corruption where government is involved, but maybe the federal government is either doesn't know or they don't care.
But our ability to trace that money, right, and see where we think it might be being used is enormously helpful from a policy perspective to unlock, we increasingly view this as a national security threat, right? I mean, I've said this now 3 times to Sam, sick of it. There's a part of the podcast where they talk about in the mornings, like if you would see a group of salespeople here doing a rah-rah cheer to get excited about the start of the day, they're doing the same thing at the Scam Center, only they're saying down with the U.S. economy, down with the European economy. And the more we can tie those linkages, the more we can unlock the power of a national security apparatus to fight this, the better.
Question here in the second row, and then one there, and I'll come over that side. I'll do this side first. I'll try and come over. We've got plenty of time for questions.
Hi. It's just another question about access and about how you actually managed to break these stories in terms of, so once you've gotten into this town and you've kind of heard stories about this scam center that might be a shopping mall that might be a scam center or whatever, presumably it's not easy to get into these scam centers. So are you actually managing to get people in there and doing kind of first-hand reporting, or are you sort of getting kind of hearsay, second-hand reports of what it's like inside? How does that kind of actually work?
Yeah, it is complicated. It's a mix of things. So some of it is second-hand reporting. So we spoke to a guy in the series who is one of these people who parties with the scam bosses and goes in and out and is this kind of weird middleman who related some of it to us. And some cases in the Philippines, for example, there have been scam centers that have been raided and are now like preserved almost as museums. I think it was the Philippines Anti-Organized Crime Commission has actually moved into a former scam center. It's like their office space now because they needed office space. And they will tour you around and say, here is the torture room and here is the karaoke bar, and you see people going by on these like hoverboard scooter things. And so that was how we did that in the podcast. I know there have been other media that actually try to do that, try to get access to live working scam centers, which we didn't quite do in this series. But yeah, that's how we got around it.
This sort of mobile phone footage comes out every now and again. People sometimes can take their phones in and get footage, but
yeah,
obviously huge risk, because if you're caught doing that,
yeah, there's another reporting group called OCCRP, and they just put out one called Scam Empire, where they got a huge data leak from a scam center in Georgia and one in Israel. It's great stuff.
We've got there's another question over there, and then I'll hold it for a second, and I'll come over there. So I'll do this side, and then I'll come back to you.
Hi, it's a question about how you stop them. The money that's being paid out is going somewhere. It's going to a bank. It's going to a national bank somewhere. They must have a bank account. So why can we not do more to follow the money and then stop them? Because you're saying, how do we stop them setting up? How do we make it more difficult? But surely, like freezing the way they collect the money is the easiest way.
So simple.
So simple. No, it's a absolutely fair question. So if you've been scammed, by the time you call your bank to move your money, you have already been scammed, right? And if you're going to call your bank and say, move this money, they may or may not know that you've been online talking to somebody as a criminal. They probably don't know that. Some banks now are putting protocols in to ask a few questions if it seems like a strange transaction. Criminals are coaching victims for how to get around that line of questioning. And at the end of the day, it is your money. And so it is very difficult for a bank to stop you moving your money if you want to move it. Now, criminals need bank accounts too. And there are rules in place called Know Your Customer rules, where banks have to actually know whether their customers are criminals. So there is, some repercussion in there. one of the things we're trying to do is link up so that the social media platforms and the telecommunications companies are able to say, we think that there is criminal communication happening here with your customer, so that the bank has better information about whether that might be happening, so that they can put in place more friction, more of an ability to help with those things. That's all true for if it's like your sort of regular bank account. If they are your investment accounts, there's a different set of rules in place, which anyway, so.
A lot of it's done in crypto. I mean, the cases that Sam, you've come across, the victims encouraged to invest in crypto. So does that mean that are they using their traditional bank account or
Well, they've got to get the money out of the bank account and into a crypto wallet, right? So that part of the piece is there. Of course, the crypto space is an evolving regulatory space, and some do and don't have good know your customer rules that would help us know who people are. And the criminals are using the ones that don't have good know your customer rules, those kinds of wallets. So in some way, shape, or form, the victim has to pull their money out of their existing accounts before they put it into a crypto wallet.
Good stuff. Question in the front row, and then we've got questions. Let's do these two in the front row, and then we'll try and work our way back.
Yeah, thanks. We've spoken about the banking industry and to some extent governments. What do you think the online platform should be doing, obviously, that they're not doing today to address the problem?
Yeah, so we work with them closely as well. So first of all, they're fully at the table. They don't want to have criminals on their platforms either, right? It's bad business for them. It's bad reputationally if we all suddenly decide that we should no longer be using any social media because it's full of criminals. And the questions come down to, what are we willing as a society to give up in terms of privacy to put in place better safeguards? So how much of your identity do you want the online platform to know? How much of your data about what you do online do you want them to have that they could use to prevent fraud and criminality? So there are measures that they could take, all of which then have sort of spillover consequences when it comes to privacy, autonomy, anonymity, and what you want to have done with that data. So those are a lot of the questions we're grappling with as policy questions. Different countries right now are treating this very differently. So here in the UK, you've put in place something called the Online Safety Act that requires those companies to do something, but it is the banks who are liable if you are scammed. So the banks have to make you whole. In Australia, they're taking a different approach where the online platforms, the telecommunications companies, the sending and the receiving bank all have liability and have to make you whole. We got nothing in the United States yet. We'll talk about that later. But so it's and it remains to be seen, because all of those legal frameworks are new, which of them are actually resulting in lower losses or fewer. What I would like to say is actually fewer attacks, right? Are we actually reducing the number of attacks on these systems and on people?
It's an interesting question. Actually, we can put this to the test right now. So tomorrow, Facebook, Gmail, WhatsApp, LinkedIn, everything that you use, all the services you use, say, right, you can only use us if you give us your passport. We just need to know who all you are. Send us a copy of your passport. Who sends them a copy of their passport tomorrow? No hands. Nobody. Oh, a couple of people would do that, right? 2 or 3 people would do that. Yeah. So that's the thing. If everybody gave their passport for online services and they knew who we were, it would stop a lot of this. But do we want to do that?
No, we could get into a super wonky discussion about digital identity and digital credentials, but I won't bore you with that.
Next, the person who's asked that, and then I'm going to try and work our way around the person with the glasses.
Yeah, sure. So all of the social media platforms, both mainstream and fringe, have very different dynamics in terms of community formation, user-to-user engagement, anonymity. And I guess back in the day with the Nigerian scam, that was quite traditionally associated with Facebook and sort of sliding into people's DMs on Facebook. But we're in a much more diversified landscape now, and I imagine it's a problem everywhere. But is there any data on whether certain platforms are proving particularly vulnerable? And if so, whether that seems to be a sort of inbuilt flaw within the platform that they don't want to address? or whether it's something to do with sort of the inherent value proposition of that platform.
I don't know that data. I don't know if you all do, but I think it's an important question. And I think the other thing too is to look at the follow the money as with all of this. Like what are the revenue generators for any of these online platforms? So Match Group, which is the sort of the biggest sort of owner of all the basically all but 3 of the online dating platforms are owned by Match Group. They have a much different business case for fighting scams than Meta does, right? Which is generated from ad revenue. And so what's going to motivate them and incentivize them to play at the table is going to look really different.
Other questions over here? A person in the grey shirt there, the chap with black hair? It's you, yes, you. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I hope this observation question isn't too garbled. I come at this from the world. I worked in corporate investigations for the past 7 years, and I noticed I was kind of growing up in that sector. There were many cases where fairly wealthy people who'd been scammed were essentially recruiting us to identify and do attribution work to work out who those were, and then they would use that essentially to go to the police. And I remember thinking, this is quite messed up. Like, this shouldn't really be the job of a private sector firm to do this. This should really be the job of the police. It makes me think there's this whole world of much poorer people being scammed out of still quite life-changing amounts of money. Is there anything that can be done apart from just not get scammed in the first place, or just be an online sleuth yourself? I mean, seems like a fairly hopeless situation.
Yeah. I'll say there's a lot of pockets of work where law enforcement is doing a better job at the upskilling, using technology, thinking differently about their jurisdictions, and cooperating, because this is a crime that crosses many borders. So they've got to think expansively about who they need to cooperate with. So I think that there is hope in terms of where law enforcement is leveling up, but they need more resources. There needs to be more public pressure on them, I think, to do that. And I think there needs to be huge investments in technology. But this conference that we're going to be at in the next couple of days, and you can check it out online if you want, there's actually going to be a number of different law enforcement officials talking about a number of their wins and where they're trying to invest more resources.
In the UK, they set up a phone line, right? Like in the US, we have 911. If you have what do you call it?
Action fraud.
Yeah.
I think it's completely useless.
Is it? Okay.
I think you get a number and it just falls into the void and nothing ever happens.
Okay. It sounds good. I mean, because we don't have anything like that in the States. Because no one really knows what to do.
We're working on it. We're working.
If you talk to cops, they have a different view. Action fraud for a user, you're right. I think it's got a bad reputation and great. For cops, it's fantastic. It's a huge database of all this stuff. They dig into it frequently, but we don't see the benefits of that. So it depends which side you're on with action fraud. Got a question in the corner there, and then I'll come to this.
Thank you. I just wanted, I work in technology, so obviously AI is very big on the news now, but technology has a long history of repeated scams everywhere. The phrase vaporware comes from the fact that a guy invented a magic machine that was supposed to create infinite energy from vapor. Anyways, without digressing, there are certain things that are repeatedly seen in all the scams in tech companies. We had Nikola, we had the case of Theranos. I wonder why all of these things are allowed to happen, because I mean someone must have looked under the hood at some point before these companies got be in the billions, right? And I'm kind of wondering, why are all these things allowed to happen? And why is the regulation maybe moving so slowly on some of these things?
Talking about on the allowed to happen in terms of the things that social media platforms do.
Is everywhere, even the cards that you can buy in supermarkets, like the 20-pound cards, those are used to traffic money all over the place, and everyone knows that. That's the only way you buy any of that stuff. So, but you find them, you still find them in every shop.
This is what's interesting about the work that you do on the documentary, Peter, was you've got companies like Rolls-Royce and Halliburton and so on, and then you've got sort of failed states like post-Saddam Iraq, and then in between you've got companies like Unitoil that sort of funnel between the two of them. Maybe that's part of the answer to this, is that you've got these conduits from the kind of regulated, legitimate world into kind of areas where you can get away with this sort of stuff.
Well, yeah, and I mean, this doesn't really answer your question, but going off of maybe there's an analogy there. In my case, this middleman company, a lot of people suspected that they were doing something wrong, but we have rule of law, and they're based in Monaco. Like, there are all these red flags, but there was no smoking gun. There was no cache of documents. And I think a little bit like what you're saying, with all of these things seem pretty suspicious, right? Why is no one really? Because no one's either they're not looking or they're not able to find the smoking gun that really proves that these methodologies are being used for illicit purposes.
I'm going to take this chap's question here because he's been waiting, and then I'll come to you over there, and then I'll try and work my way back.
Thank you. On the metaphor of antivirus software, which has been around for many years, for £100 a year or something, you can subscribe to it that will protect you against viruses. Is there, or is there likely to become, personal protection software which would protect, which maybe you pay £100 a year for, which would protect you against some of these scams?
I think that business is already starting. So I think you've already got some technology providers. There's a few things in the market. I'm not endorsing any product up here that you can buy to help with some of it. Some of it helps to know one of the ways the scam can occur. Particularly if it's a type of scam called a tech support scam, is when they'll put remote access software on your computer. So there's tools you can buy that would detect whether that's been unknowingly installed. There are other things that companies can buy to detect whether through data algorithms it might be a scammer on your platform. So already there's a monetization of the anti-scam world coming to a consumer product near you. And hopefully some of them will be effective.
Question over there in the far corner, and then I'll try and work my way across. So I'm going to have to come round. Oh, there you go.
Thank you. Hey, focusing more on the sort of human trafficking side of the industry, Myanmar has been like the epicenter of that, right? Like, obviously it's happened to a degree in other Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia, but just the sort of nature of the lawless areas where these scam compounds are in Myanmar make it like a particular hub of the human trafficking side. But in the last few weeks, as I think you referenced at the start, there has been this crackdown in Thailand, sort of under pressure from the Chinese, and there's been a few thousand released from some KK Park, among others. Do you think that is a sustainable kind of crackdown, or that it's going to lead to an end to the kind of human rights abuses that you're seeing in some of these compounds, or is it just a kind of like surface level attempt at sort of looking like they're making some sort of difference on that side of things?
Yeah, it would be nice to be optimistic about that. But as Geoff mentioned earlier, it's in Myanmar, it's in excess of 100,000 people in Myanmar. And then that doesn't include Cambodia and Laos and the Philippines. So when you think of the number of people who've been released compared to the number of people who are still inside, I mean, it's kind of a drop in the bucket. And then there have been discouraging signs as well. I mean, with the dismantling of USAID in the States, that people who were in that world of trying to fight these scam centers say that has had a real detrimental effect on what they're able to do. So it would be nice if that kept up, but it's I don't know if it's terribly promising. Yeah.
Question, thank you. We've got a lady here on the left.
The podcast is amazing, by the way. So thank you for that. My question is kind of related to the earlier one about the money, but it's more the other end. Once somebody has been laundered and clean and out there in the world, where is it going? And could we not follow the money in that respect? Because I know that there has been some attempt, I think, in this country, so that when you buy a property for like 10 million or something, that they're doing a bit more digging about where's the money coming from. Could it not be attacked from that end?
I feel like you should answer.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah.
Everyone's good at you.
Well, it's interesting. The point of money laundering is to clean the money of any link to. So if you're going to do that, the money laundering has failed. If as law enforcement you can work out where the money went and track it once it's spent, then the laundering process has not been followed correctly. And so good example in the UK, as you say, if you go and try and buy a house for 10 million, solicitors under the conveyancers under the Solicitors Regulation Authority have to ask where you got the money. You know, how have you got 10 million for this house? Particularly if you're buying it outright in cash, or God forbid with Bitcoin. But that's because in the UK we've got the Solicitors Regulation Authority and conveyancers and deeds and stuff like that. The way this money's being spent in Cambodia and Laos, nobody's bats an eyelid if you turn up with 10 million and want to buy a house. Oh, fantastic, brilliant, I get a commission for that, great. So tracking it at the other end is even harder than tracking it previous to being laundered. Tracking it post-laundering, particularly in that environment, and particularly with cryptocurrency, which is where a lot of this stuff's going through. Again, one of the points of cryptocurrency is to vanish the money into a network where it just can't be traced for long enough to recover it. That's the key thing. You can trace cryptocurrency, but tracing it and recovering it is the thing. So sorry to give a grim answer to that, but I think concentrating on the earlier stuff rather than the later post-laundering stuff would be where I put my money, so to speak.
But it's a great question of where is all that money? It's hundreds of billions. I mean, that money is going somewhere, and there have been indications that it's coming right back here and right back to the States. There was a major Singaporean money laundering case, a bust, where one of the people who was involved owned property on Oxford Street here in London. I mean, pardon me? JD Sports was like a tenant in the building, yeah, or Foot Locker was a tenant in the building, yeah, on Oxford Street.
Astonishing bit in the podcast, that's all. We had a question here. Yes, that lady in the sky.
I'm interested that our previous government here in the UK, when they boasted that they had reduced crime, but they didn't include fraud at all. They prefer to blame the victims rather than do anything about it. Also, another point is that when you are scammed sometimes, I had a card cloned at a petrol station. When I reported to my bank, because it was in the local paper, if you use this garage between these dates, then you may well have been scammed. When I reported it to my bank, they said they wouldn't do anything about it, but if I wanted to go to the police, I could. But they wouldn't cancel my card. And a week later, I found that money had gone out of my account, and then I had to prove that I hadn't
Did you get the money back in the end? Just to
I did get it back, but that's not the point. They're wasting customers' money, and I just feel that fraud is just not taken seriously at all as a crime. It's
yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment from a sort of public point of view. I was at a conference recently with the Home Office, who would argue strongly against that and say they've now got a fraud strategy in the Home Office, which doesn't sound very exciting, but I don't. They're probably
terribly exciting to me.
They're probably going to czar as well, but as far as they're concerned, this is world leading. Like, other countries don't have even a fraud strategy, so they are. I think they're making the right noises. Whether that translates into action, effectiveness, and a different experience, I don't know, but. Certainly the Conservative government, I think, got to the point where they realised fraud wasn't just a few old ladies losing some money and old blokes. It's a national security, it's a serious double issue.
Yeah, but no, I mean, but I honestly, but this is where I have my love letter to journalism, which is to these gentlemen, right? Tying that story to the stories of human trafficking and where this money is going and the further illicit crime that it's creating is a really important part to raising this alarm. To say it's not just that my card got stolen and it was inconvenient and it took me a long time to get the money back, but what happened? What was the attack on our society as a result? And we have to tell that story to get action.
Gosh.
Sounds like next podcast then. I'll try and squeeze in three. I've got one here, and then one. Well, you've already had a question, so we'll see how. Hang on. Chap in the front row here, and then we'll come over here.
Question for all the panel. If, like me, you get an email from FedEx every other day telling me X, Y, Z, are you ever tempted to follow through as though you are a mug to see whether you can actually, in some way or other, break apart what's going on?
Yeah, I did a bit of that early on, like, cause for a while I would get a ton of these. I think in trying to do that, engaged with somebody on WhatsApp, and then all of a sudden I was getting inundated with people on WhatsApp trying to pig butcher me. And did get to the point where I got on the phone with somebody, but then I think later thought better of it, because when I learned that if that person is a human trafficking victim, and if they are found to have killed the customer, meaning had somebody on the string and then they got away, they are punished. So I stopped doing that after a while. Yeah.
But there are some really great YouTube videos of people who do that.
Yeah.
If you'd like to be entertained by it.
We'll try this one at home.
Yeah.
Question here, and then.
Hi. I'm interested in kind of the corporatization and especially the human trafficking aspect of the pig butchering scam. It seems to be sort of associated specifically with that scam. And I wonder if if it's because of the fact that it is in Southeast Asia and people kind of turn a blind eye to those big scam centers, or if that's sort of what's to come for scams that are based out of other parts of the world, like, sextortion, which is more associated with Nigeria, and like counterfeit, bags and stuff. So I'm wondering, in your experience or in any of your research, if you found anything sort of suggesting that kind of model for scamming is moving outside of the pig butchering scam.
Yeah, Kate made the point earlier about these. You can buy these packages online to learn how to do this, and people do and are. And it seems like every region of the world has its own kind of flavor on this thing. But particularly, we talked to people. It didn't end up in the podcast, but we talked to people who were in parts of Eastern Europe, in Georgia, where they have similar centers, or they've rented out a floor of an office building in Tbilisi. And they're doing something that looks a lot like pig butchering, and maybe just isn't called that because the term is originally a Chinese term. So yeah, definitely, it seems to be getting picked up all over the world, and is not really restricted to that region anymore.
So one more question here, and I think that's our lot. We'll probably talk to a close after that. So make it a good one.
Thank you. The other day, I had to make an international payment, and before doing so, my bank provided me kindly with a piece of legal gobbledygook, basically where I was signing away my life and all my possessions in making this payment. In other words, that the bank was covering themselves against this transaction. It would be nice to hear if there's any movement in terms of getting the banks to protect their customers as opposed to just protecting their own interests. For example, dare I suggest, the banks running, let's say, seminars on getting their customers together, even online, and showing them how to protect themselves against scams. Goodness me, why can't it happen?
The reason you got the gobbledygook legalese here in the UK is because if you later say that wire transfer, that international transfer was a scam, the bank has to pay you back. So they've put that stuff in, not because they won't, they're trying to quote protect themselves. Of course they are, right? They've got plenty of lawyers, but because at the end of the day, they're trying to put in some friction to make you think a minute and say, actually, do I know who I'm sending this money to? So they're trying to come up with ways, and I'm not trying to be an apologist for banks. I think there are a million things that they could do better, right? But just in that instance, they're trying to think of any ways that they can to try to put some amount of friction in that helps to make the customer stop and think about that transaction.
So, I thought we have some more time, actually. I thought we were going to finish early. So you get to ask your questions, sir, and then we'll come across.
Yeah, I'd like to actually sort of repose the question that you asked a little while ago about why not chase the money, the hundreds of billions being moved. And I know crypto is supposed to be invisible, but it's not that invisible when you're actually doing things with it. And if there was the will, it's impossible for me to believe that there wouldn't be ways Okay, admittedly, I've got a conspiracy side to me, so I'll grant you that. And then I'm going to feed Peter a line, which is Peter, which is sort of connected and sort of not. But that's a serious question because I don't believe that it's possible, whether you're in Myanmar or anywhere else, and you're dealing with hundreds of billions. It's not about a $10 million mansion. You're talking about massive sums of money that are being moved about. And it's impossible for me to believe that if there wasn't actually political will in the Western countries to figure out where it's going, that there would be action. It's implausible to me. And then Peter, because I can't resist, and you can pass if you want, but when the Asani brothers were arrested in Monaco, who did the police, when the police gave them their first phone call, who was it to?
These are the guys who are at the center of this unit oil company actually got arrested and then.
Yeah. So, well, it's two questions here. So the first one I'll leave to others to answer. But the family, the father and the two sons, who were at the center of this case, when the arrest warrants came out, the red notices came out from the UK, they fled. One went to Iran, one went to Libya, and one went to Italy. And in Italy, he got on a plane. Was trying to get on a plane from Rome to Buenos Aires, presumably to escape because Buenos Aires has no extradition, and so he gets caught there. And what we discovered in our reporting, and we literally over the shoulder of the Italian police officer who did the arrest, is that this brother who was arrested called an FBI agent. And that was sort of the beginning of this whole effort. Up until then, it was a British case. The Brits had put, I can't remember now how many, several, huge, 15 million pounds or something into doing this case. It was a big case. I think it was the biggest case of the SFO at that point. And, this was going to be a huge, huge case in the UK. And when the guy gets arrested, he calls Americans, and the Americans are like, we'll take care of you. And so, they were very cleverly played the two law enforcement agencies off of each other.
Astonishing moment in the documentary.
How do they do that?
Well, so the watch the film. Essentially, there's a cultural difference, there's a legal difference between the U.S. and the UK. In the UK, you don't have, as far as I understand, the preponderance of deferred prosecution agreements that we have in the United States, and Canada has some as well. So in the U.S., they can essentially get huge fines, hundreds of millions of dollars of fines from companies. They don't have to be American companies. In fact, very often they're not American companies. Rolls-Royce, they go after companies that fall under the jurisdiction of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act because they do any business in the U.S. If you do any business in the U.S., then you fall, even if you're a foreign company. So Samsung, Rolls-Royce, a lot of the companies were not American, but they got these fines from them, and the incentive from the U.S. side was, let's punish the companies by getting fines and putting money into the U.S. Treasury, rather than putting a couple guys in prison in the UK, like whatever, who cares about that? But in the SFO's approach was a very different one. It was like,
Can't the UK still prosecute?
yeah, there's no double jeopardy. They couldn't prosecute. They could prosecute. It's complicated. They got rid of the prosecutor. They essentially they defamed the prosecutor and got him fired under false pretenses, because he allegedly called an FBI agent the C word. That was the great crime he did, which is apparently a term of endearment in this country. So, and at that point, the SFO just was like, this is too complicated. The head of the SFO was called before 2 parliamentary hearings with this very question, like, what, you still could have gone after them, why didn't you? And her answer was a pretty weak answer, which is like, well, the Americans are already pursuing it, and we had other things to deal with. So, but it's complicated.
Just on the laundering process as well, I just want to address that. You're right, it's a vast quantity of money that's being made. I think the thing to bear in mind is that a lot of that's in cryptocurrency. So, as Kate's described, the victim will use their bank account to buy crypto to send to the scammers. It's in cryptocurrency. And yes, you can trace cryptocurrency. But what's going on in Southeast Asia is part of these scam compounds is casino complexes. Those casino complexes take bets in crypto. So what you do is you put the crypto into the casino, it disappears into this black box, it comes out on the other side either as casino winnings, which you can extract, or there's loads of people around Southeast Asia who are really keen on crypto and want to invest and want to buy crypto, don't really care where they buy it from, so you sell the crypto to them. So that's how you wash hundreds of millions of dollars. No, I'm not giving you instructions, don't do that. But
But you made a great analogy earlier. We were just chatting before this event that you can trace crypto, but it's like it's like someone stole your TV and was running down the street, and you can track them. You have an AirTag on your TV. You know exactly where they are, but somehow the whole system it's impossible to actually get that TV back. So all you can do is watch your TV float off into another neighborhood.
And there's some beautiful charts the cryptocurrency tracing companies put out of where all the money is going. You think, great, and can we get it back? Oh no, we just traced it. So anyway, we had another question. Sorry, before we go on, a question here, and we might have time for the last one.
Thank you. My question was really around the globalized nature of this business and that it's international. And I wanted to ask the panel, how pessimistic or optimistic should we be around the likelihood of international cooperation and international law enforcement cooperation to counter it? Because it seems to me that you need to counter it at an international level. And in the context of the current situation where the West is sort of fragmenting, how pessimistic or optimistic should we be?
Oh, I think it's both and. I think, like I said, I think there is already international cooperation on this. I think it needs more resourced and more light shown on it. Interpol is involved. Most of the major countries have groups participating in dialogue about it. Our own, as far as I know, in the United States, the FBI and the Department of Justice are still in dialogue with international counterparts about going after scams, the people that work on that. But more is needed. One of the reasons that I am so focused on really turning this into a national security conference is to turn up the heat on that. And the ability to drive resources towards that, because otherwise I think it makes it difficult to continue making that case.
Last question then to you. So, no pressure.
So it sounds like most of those scams go through crypto, and is most of that through these fake online investment portals? And if so, from the podcast, it sounded like that might be a really good place to go in and have friction or a stop by bringing down those websites and showing like this is a fake site, do not invest in particular, because those scams take such a long time. And I just wondered, what's the scope? How difficult is it to find those sites and chase them down?
I'm still learning a lot about the pieces of it. So a couple of things, and then other people who know more tell me more. It's a little bit of whack-a-mole, right? So take one down, 10 more pop up, because it's actually very easy to start a website. It gets to other questions that we talked about here about how easy it is to create things online. And there's some other interesting differences. So here in the UK, for example, if you report to, let's say it's Action Fraud, or that there's this fake website, the UK government has decided that as a matter of policy, it is a public good that we take that site down if we get that report. And they've put in resources to make that happen. In the United States, that's not true. You have to first go through prosecution and prove that that site is fraudulent before it gets taken down, which, as we know, takes a long time. So whether we're going to do those two processes in parallel or sequentially is a policy choice we have to get through. And then whose job is it to take it down? So if it is a fake website impersonating an existing company, those companies, particularly the large ones, invest lots of money into taking down impersonations. If it is just a purely fake and it's quote unquote victimless in that scenario, whose job is it to spend the resources to take that down, right? Again, so you can choose that it's a public good or it's somebody else's job. So these are some of the things we're grappling with to take those down.
Good stuff. Thank you for that. I think we're just about at the end of time. There is something we can all do obviously now though, which is listen to the podcast, watch the documentary and so on, is being aware of this stuff happening and speaking to as many people as we know as possible. The fact that, if you get that strange email or that strange approach from WhatsApp, do we know each other? To have your ears and your antennae out for those scams so that we can all not fall victim and the people we know and love can not fall victim as well. We'll thank our panelists, Sam Colbert, Peter Klein, and Kate Griffin. Thank you for listening.